Hello everyone, I'm Joel Glenn Wixon. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a certified addiction specialist working in the field for over 20 years now. I say that for a reason, and I'll get to that in a bit, but I also want to identify myself in some other ways. I'm cis male, identify as male, and use the pronouns he and him, and I also want to acknowledge the caretakers of the local land that I work on, live on, stand on. The Wabanaki people are, as far as we can understand, are the people who are the original caretakers of this land, although it's unclear because my ancestors have obliterated the vast majority of them. There is a small Penobscot reservation very far north of here, and some Abenaki land now very far northwest of here, where some of the original people still are, but they are pushed so far away that a lot of their history has been obliterated by my ancestors. So acknowledging them positions me here in this moment to have this conversation. This is a response to a video that Anthony posted about his experience of intervention. And I just wanted to share some knowledge and wisdom that I've gained from the people that I've had the fortune to come to know over these past 25 years, which is why I use that. I think I just want to acknowledge how much I've learned from people that I've worked with over those years and been honored to witness their experiences of life. So in the context of the intervention experience that Anthony had, I wanted to share this notion that's evolved in the course of this work with me and these other people I've had the fortune to know. And I've called it Untervention, Un-tervention, but it also occurred to me the other day that another way to describe it is an intersection where really it's about people coming together to share their experience. Now, one of the cool things about this way of having this kind of gathering is that it doesn't actually require me, and so I always appreciate experiences and opportunities that where I can pass something on that I've learned from others that they then take to their family groups or communities of concern that they are connected to, where they can enact certain ideas that they may find useful. And I'm working very hard to move away from the idea of change, to not speak about the idea of change in the context of this conversation, because it's not really something that I have experienced a lot. And I think you'll understand that a bit too when I talk about exactly how this process works. So Anthony articulated very clearly, and I think very well, some of the founding ideas in the context of intervention that can be profoundly problematic and have been very problematic in the lives of many of the people that I've worked with, not only in the context of an intervention, but just in the invitations that family members and community members receive in how to engage with people who they would describe as alcoholic or addicted. Those aren't terms that I choose to use. I'm more interested in the idea of people who have problematic relationships with substances, or even people who have relationships with substances. We often deem these relationships problematic, again, because of cultural limitations. And so this process that I'm going to describe really allows us to move completely away from that, in that it's not a requirement. And the other thing that I want to acknowledge, which I try to do anytime that I talk about these ideas, I'm very, very excited about these ideas, find them to be profoundly useful in people taking their lives back from a variety of different things. But I also want to acknowledge the care and the love of folks who have tried other ways of being. And in recognizing the profound pain that Anthony went through in the context of his experience, I just want to acknowledge that the folks who do this work generally don't do it for purposes other than their profound care and concern. However, those cares and concerns can get appropriated by cultural invitations that encourage us to act and think in certain ways, and can create things that can be very, very harmful and destructive, like interventions. And I guess it's just this notion that I believe that people's intention is not to be hurtful and destructive, and yet that can also and very frequently be the outcome. So having experienced and participated in the kind of interventions that Anthony spoke about, and finding them really, for the most part, to be not particularly helpful. And so it's important for me to be clear about what I mean by that. I'm not suggesting that in an intervention environment where the person is confronted and usually treatment resources are offered. Now, in Anthony's case, it was very limited in terms of what was offered. But treatment resources are offered, and sort of there's this treatment plan that's kind of conceived before the person arrives and implemented. And sometimes, in fact, the person participates and will go to the treatment facility that's been assigned. But it's not about that as an outcome. It's really way longer term than that. The effects that it has on the person's life, the effects in terms of the ideas that they're invited into, how they then think about themselves, and how it also affects the community that's involved and the family members that are involved. What ideas get supported and what ideas get tossed off to the side. And so having seen this happen in people's lives over and over again and being frustrated by the fact that it seemed very troubling and disturbing in the moment, and then ultimately the effects on people's lives weren't particularly useful, I tried to come up with an alternative, and all that happened before I was exposed to narrative ideas. So when I finally was fortunate enough to be exposed to these ideas that I'm, as I said, currently so excited about, I kind of had this epiphany and thought about how these ideas could be transformative in the context of this notion of intervention, and so the idea of untervention comes up. So all that being said, now I'm going to get into exactly what an untervention looks like. So it begins with a conversation, and the possibility that something like this might happen evolves usually in the context of family members who would come to me with concerns about somebody who's in their life, a family member, or also a community member, somebody who they know, not in a family context, but are familiar with, and that they see as struggling with substance use. And that they want to do something about their struggle, and they want to have some impact on their struggle. Now, one of the things that I say to family members all the time when they come to me in this context, who are asking me what they should do, well, I'm very much interested in this question of, in order to achieve what? So if a family member says, my son is using heroin, they've been using it for a long time, they've tried to stop, they keep going back to it. I actually had this conversation not too long ago with a family, and we need to know what to do. And so I say, in order to achieve what? And many times the response is, in order to stop them from using. And so this is a time when I'm very, very grateful for all the experience that I've learned, and the wisdom and knowledge that I've gained from the people who I've come to know, because I'm very familiar with the idea that ultimately the family member is not in a position to stop them. That the idea that they're going to stop what this person's doing is unrealistic. Although I'm always open to possibilities, and the idea that might actually that the family member might actually be able to stop a person from using. It's nothing's impossible as far as I'm concerned. But certainly what I've learned so far is that generally does not. The family member generally cannot have that effect, and so I start to talk to them about the idea that, well, let's take up some questions about what's in your control, and so the idea of whether or not the son continues to live in their house, whether or not they choose to give the son money, all these things are things that are completely in their control. And that gets me to this next idea where I say, well, and so it's important, what I've learned from other people is that it's important that that you do the things that you need to do so that you're okay with whatever the outcome is. So if you're making a choice about whether or not you should kick the person out of your house, do that in the context of the fact that you can kick them out of your house. That's a choice that you can make. If in fact the outcome of that is something that you couldn't tolerate, if they end up dying in the street, which is a possibility, then you wouldn't be okay with that outcome, well then don't kick them out of your house. Because the idea that there's some specific relationship between kicking someone out of your house and what the outcome is going to be, it's just not my experience. I mean, I've seen a variety of permutations of these kinds of ideas, and the notion that if we kick them out of the house, if we stop giving them money, then that will change their behavior. And that's not my experience, which gets me to this notion of enabling that I have a very difficult time with. And we'll get to resistance and those sorts of things in the context of the Untervention. But it all builds, this is all a building process. It's not just somebody calls me, wants to do an intervention, and I show up and away we go. It's a process whereby I'm trying to understand the intentions of the family member and the community. I'm trying to understand the inner relationship between the effects this substance is having on all the people who are involved. And so this notion of enabling comes up very, very frequently. And my stand about enabling is that, if you can enable somebody to continue to do something, then you can disable them from doing something, and that goes back to the point that I made about it's not my experience that that's actually possible either. And so we get to this notion where, I think it's important for family members to do things so that they can be comfortable with whatever the outcome happens to be. Now, that's not to say that if they don't kick the child out of the house that things won't turn out poorly. They can certainly turn out poorly, but my hope is that by a family making the decision to say, I'm gonna keep the kid in the house because I couldn't stand the thought of them dying in the street if I kicked them out of the house. Well, then, so there they have it. So the child stays in the house, and the parents haven't made the choice to kick them out. Again, it's not connected to outcomes, because my experience of outcomes is that they are as varied as the people that live on the face of this planet. That what's useful for one person is completely unuseful for another, and vice versa. I've seen many, many things that I won't get into here. But if in fact we get to the point where this notion of untervention comes up, and the family really, really wants to get together and have a conversation that includes these sorts of ideas, then I would say, okay, great. So it's really important for me that the person be fully aware of what we're doing. The notion that Anthony talked about, where he was completely bushwhacked by the conversation, is completely inconsistent with anything that I'd want to do. One of the reasons why is because I'm perfectly comfortable being completely open and direct about exactly why we're there. And so there's no reason to have it be a secret thing. There's no reason for the person to be pulled in kind of against their will. And that I would be very clear with a family member that really what I'm interested in doing is understanding this person's experience of substances in their life, and understanding, the effects that the substances have had, and understanding, if they have any intentions in relation to modifying that relationship. And one of the problems with the notion of intervention is that it suggests that the person's really interested in continuing to live the way they're living. And in order for parents to show up at my office, community members, concerned folks to show up at my office to talk about something that's going on in somebody's life, it's very unlikely that they're psyched about what's happening. It's very unlikely that the way their life is unfolding is something that they're excited about continuing. So again, there's possibilities that that's not the case, but my experience is that in fact there is something about their life, and I'm talking about now the person who would be the quote subject of the intervention, although that actually never happens. But in terms of who we're talking about, and so family really wants to get together and talk about this, and so there's at least two ways that I've done this. One is to actually have a sit down with the person who would be the subject of the intervention beforehand. Another would be, if the person's interested, and sometimes this is the case, where the family member can say, we really want you to come in and have a conversation with this guy, and it seems like it might be helpful, and they're willing to come in. But either way, if the person arrives by themselves or if the person arrives with the family members. And I should also say, I've had situations where after meeting with a person who is described as somebody struggling with substance use, after meeting with them several times, the entire family may show up because I make it very clear that I'm open to various permutations of conversations. And so if the person wants to bring the family in because they're so concerned and they want them to have an opportunity to talk with me about what's really going on, then we'll all get together. So either I have a meeting with the person beforehand, the person's willing to come in with the family, or the person that I've been meeting with for a while brings the whole family. These interventions can evolve in a variety of different ways. But the most important thing is that the experience of the person who's in relation to the substance directly is really the center of the conversation. And I find that when we honor that person's experience and ask them questions about that experience, that these notions that we all have to band together and convince them that they need to do something different really evaporate very quickly. And and ultimately because that their struggle is something that they're very familiar with, and the idea that their life might be some way other than it actually is at this point, where they're in the midst of this struggle, is not something that that is foreign to them. It's something that's very close to them, and so there's another fundamental idea underneath this notion, and that is that it is not my agenda, it is not my intention to stop them from using. And that might seem kind of radical. Certainly is completely different than an intervention where that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. I move away from that position ultimately because if I walk into a conversation with the idea that this is what I'm supposed to do, that I have identified what the outcome is supposed to be of this conversation, there's many things that will be spoken about, either directly or in the context of the absent but implicit, that I will miss. And one of the things that stood out for me in Anthony's video was his desire to actually go to a detox, and his interest in not going to a facility where there wasn't a detox, and a very clear sense that he had in the context of his experience of his use as to why that was a bad idea. And this is a big thing for me, because this notion that the people who are experiencing these relationships with substances have a tremendous amount of knowledge in the context of how they would want their lives to be, and what sorts of things would be facilitative of them having that life. They're very familiar with these things and have lots and lots of experience, and are aware of what helps them and what doesn't. And so absolutely want that to be a part of the conversation. But again, starting from a position of, so really what are the effects that this substance has had on your life, and kind of how do you have a sense of where you want things to go from here? And centering the person, not myself, but the person, and then having a conversation. And I'll tell you, one of the most amazing things that happens in these conversations is that the families are then in a position to witness this knowledge, witness these intentions, and that becomes a transformative process. So instead of the intervention process where family members invited to come in and we're going to kind of get this person to do what they should do, and the family member is like invited into this position of making sure that happens, predicated on the notion that there is a specific thing that is the right thing to do and where this should all go, and creating all kinds of possibilities for failure in their lives because what happens if it doesn't go in that direction. This is a completely different process, and it's very similar to outsider witnessing and the communities, witnessing communities and reflecting team processes, where in fact they might even have the opportunity to engage in the context of that reflecting team model that you can look other places to find out more about. But there's a very specific process that you go through in the context of reflections. But the important point that I'm trying to make about that is that the experience of the person in the room as they start to speak to their experience of their substance use and kind of what direction they might want things to head in, there are things that the family will experience, and it's funny because I know that I don't want to say it, that I know where the conversation is going to go, but it's hard for me to not reflect my experience of how oftentimes people have had these profound experiences of witnessing things in these family members that they never would have witnessed before, that they never would have known was true. And a lot of times these are linked to people's intentions and their struggles, but really, I think most profoundly, the actual relationship with a substance that we are indoctrinated into thinking is one specific way. It's a destructive relationship. It tears them down. It breaks them apart. It ruins everything. Although in many instances that may be true, the initial relationship with a substance isn't like that at all. And anyone who's had relationships with substances or processes or sex or the internet or whatever it is that get us into a place where this becomes a primary distraction to take us away from things in our life that we're struggling with, it's very effective early on. It really does work very well. If substances didn't do what they're supposed to do, then we wouldn't have 100 and some odd people dying of overdoses every day. These people are not dying because they're stupid. They're dying because they entered in a relationship that has some positive effects for them, but also can be very destructive. And then this gets us into, in the context of these conversations, this notion that their actual substance use is ultimately emblematic of things that they stand for and things that they hold dear. And And so very, very different from the intervention notion, where ideas about denial and resistance would keep me from even considering these conversations. This notion of the absent but implicit that speaks to the idea that what we do, what we say, these are all manifestations of things that we hold dear. And when we're doing that double listening process, we can start to see those things, not at all a part of an intervention process, but central to this notion of untervention and intersection. The reason why this is how the intersection notion comes up, because so here we are having this conversation with this person, predicated on the notion that that their substance use is A, not something that's our responsibility to stop, and B, that their substance use is in some way emblematic of the things that they hold dear and the things that they stand for. And all of a sudden, this transformative process happens where the family members are now seeing their substance use in a completely different light. Now, there's never going to be a time, well, at least there hasn't yet. I mean, again, it's possible. But up to this point, I have not experienced a time where ultimately the substance use is continuing to help this person take these stands. That their substance use had the ability to support them in some way to move forward in their lives for some way. But that relationship is actually starting to break down, and the person's starting to understand how it's not supporting them moving that direction as much as it used to. And yet, it's still very seductive, it's still very central to their lives. But as we start to evolve and really illuminate these positions that they hold and these things that they stand for, there starts to become an alternative. And so it's no longer stopping doing the thing that's keeping you alive, no longer doing the thing that makes you feel normal, which these are all things that will come out in the context of these conversations. It's the idea that you can actually continue to take these stands for the things that matter to you, continue to hold up these things that you hold dear, and allow the substance use to be something that's further and further in the rearview mirror. But it allows for a transition that's completely impossible in intervention. Intervention is based on the notion that you stop using because it's bad and you're supposed to, and we're your family and we're telling you why and how destructive it is. But it leaves them with nothing. So ultimately they stop because everybody's pissed off at them. This is a completely different approach, which allows for these evolving notions of the things that they hold dear to come up and to be very much a part of their lives and more understood by all the people that they have in their lives, who in many instances are surprised to hear these things, but want to understand. And so part of the process that can also be, and this is more, so the process that I outlined just now is more how it's evolved in the context of the absent but implicit. But there have certainly been, and this is one of the things that really people can do without the involvement of somebody who's really familiar with the ideas of narrative, and it's more linked to the notion of externalizing problems, where in the context of the Untervention, we talk as a group. So if there's 4 people in the group, 5 including me, then it's 5 people talking about the effects of this substance in their lives. Those 5 people include the person who would be identified as the problem. And so no longer are the identified problem or the person who's being intervened upon, they are a participant in the group. And so everyone in the group is talking about the effects of this substance in their lives. So again, this is more an externalizing the problem sort of notion of Untervention, and what I just outlined was more an absent but implicit idea. And the reason why I make a distinction between those two is because so far in my life, we are so indoctrinated into the idea of not asking questions. We are so indoctrinated, I'm just going to put a little wood here in the fire. We are so indoctrinated into the idea of expert positions that it can be quite complex to get people to really understand this notion of the absent but implicit. We are so caught up in expert positions that we think about the idea that somebody knows more, that the experts know everything, that the absent but implicit is about secret knowledges that people don't know about, that they don't even know that they are intoning when they speak. And so this notion that absent but implicit is completely different than that can be a little bit more complex to get across. And so participating in these conversations to illuminate the absent but implicit sometimes a little bit more important to have somebody who has some knowledge about the ideas. Whereas externalizing ideas, I find, are a little bit more simple, because having people get caught up with this notion that that the substance is having effects on everyone can happen. My experience happen way more quickly. So that's the sort of thing that you can catch up. You can actually sit with a family and I have done this and say, I'm interested in. We've been talking about the effects that the substance has had on your life, and I'm wondering if you've ever talked to the person that you're talking to about the effects that the substance has had on their life. And through a kind of a brief sort of back and forth, people can actually get an understanding of how this notion of externalizing the effects, and can kind of take that to a conversation that they can have sort of without me being there. And that I've seen that happen, and it's been useful in many instances. So again, that's one of the things that I'm really excited about this notion of intervention or intersection, that it doesn't really require somebody who's identified as an expert, and that helps to move away from the notion that the expert's going to solve the problem, that the problem is the person, and that what we need to do is kind of interact with them in a way that situates them in that context. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there for now, and I'm happy to interact with folks if you have questions about what I've talked about. I'm going to have my contact information at the end of the video, but I can tell you right now, 617-312-8883 in the United States is my telephone number. jgwixon@aol.com is my email address. You can also comment on this video. There's lots of stuff on Facebook and a variety of different social media that I post. You can get in touch with me that way. But that's what I wanted to share. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch. I hope this is useful, and thanks again.